What would you do if you found 7 children dying in the cold, and every single adult in town had already decided to look away? One man. No money. No power. No plan. Just a broken heart that had forgotten how to feel, until 7 orphaned kids forced it wide open again. This is the story of Elias Boone, a drifter who stumbled into the most dangerous battle of his life, not against wolves, not against winter, but against a powerful man who believed children were property. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Iron Hollow, Dakota Territory. Winter, 1886. The snow had been falling for 3 days when Elias Boone rode into Iron Hollow with nothing but a bedroll, a half-empty canteen, and a soul so hollowed out by grief that he barely noticed the cold anymore. He noticed it now. The wind came off the northern plains like something alive and furious, driving needles of ice against every exposed inch of skin. His horse, a scarred roan gelding he called Cinder, dropped her head low against the assault and plodded forward with the grim patience of an animal that had learned to endure. Elias leaned into the saddle and pulled the collar of his wool coat tighter around his neck, though it did almost nothing. The coat had been good once. That was a long time ago. Iron Hollow appeared out of the whiteout the way most frontier towns appeared, reluctantly, as if ashamed of itself. A single muddy main street flanked by warped timber buildings, a general store with a cracked window, a saloon whose sign had lost half its letters to the weather, a church at the far end of the road, its white paint peeling in long strips like sunburned skin. Elias had ridden through 100 towns like this one. He had never intended to stop in any of them longer than it took to water his horse and buy a meal. He pulled Cinder up in front of the livery stable and swung down from the saddle, his knees aching in the cold. A boy of about 14 appeared in the doorway, the stable hand lean and sharp-faced, with intelligent eyes that took in Elias's worn gear and registered exactly what kind of man he was looking at. "$1 a night for the horse," the boy said. "Storm's getting worse. You'll want her inside." "I know what a storm looks like," Elias said, but he wasn't unkind about it. He handed over a coin. "She gets grain, not just hay. She's earned it." The boy caught the coin, studied Elias for a moment with those sharp eyes, and nodded. "There's a boarding house 2 doors down. Mrs. Tilden runs it. She's particular about mud on the floors. I'll mind my boots." Elias found Mrs. Tilden's boarding house exactly where the boy had said, a narrow 2-story structure wedged between the general store and a closed millinery shop. The woman who answered the door was small and severe, with iron-gray hair pinned so tightly to her skull that Elias wondered if it gave her headaches. She looked him up and down the way you'd look at a piece of livestock you suspected was diseased. $2 a night," she said. "Includes breakfast. No drinking in the rooms. No card games. No women." "Yes, ma'am." "You planning on staying long?" Elias glanced back at the street where the snow was now coming down so hard he could barely make out the building across the road. The wind screamed between the eaves. "Just until the storm breaks," he said. He had said that before. In other towns. Other storms. He had always meant it. The storm did not break. It deepened through the night with a kind of malicious persistence, piling snow against every door and window in Iron Hollow, until the town felt less like a settlement and more like a collection of caves dug into the white earth. By morning, the drifts along the main street stood chest-high in places, and the temperature had dropped so savagely that the water in Elias's wash basin had frozen solid while he slept. He ate Mrs. Tilden's breakfast, salt pork, hard biscuits, and coffee that was more ambition than flavor, and sat at the long communal table with 4 other guests. A land surveyor from the territorial capital who complained at length about his delayed schedule, 2 cattle buyers who spoke only to each other, a salesman with a leather case full of patent medicines who kept clearing his throat as though preparing to launch into a sales pitch that no one had asked for. None of them looked at Elias. None of them looked at each other, really. That was the particular loneliness of the frontier boarding house. A collection of strangers forced into proximity by geography and weather, each one carefully maintaining the fiction that the others did not exist. Elias had become very good at that fiction over the past 6 years. After breakfast, with nowhere to be and nothing calling him forward, he did what he always did in strange towns during bad weather. He walked. Not for any particular destination, just to move, just to keep the blood circulating and the thoughts from going to the dark places they always wanted to go when he stayed still too long. He walked the length of the main street, past the saloon where two men were already arguing about something through the fogged window, past the general store where a woman in a heavy coat was struggling to push the door open against a waist-high drift, past the church and beyond, to where the town gave out and the open frontier began. And that was where he heard it. He stopped. The wind was loud. It was always loud out here, a constant roaring presence that swallowed smaller sounds the way the land swallowed smaller men. But underneath it, beneath the howl and the hiss of driven snow, there was something else, a child's voice, high and thin and desperate. Elias turned toward the sound. Behind the old chapel, not the main church, but a smaller, older structure that looked as if it had been abandoned years ago, there was a ruin. He could make it out through the snowfall now, the charred skeleton of what had once been a cabin, its walls half collapsed, its roof entirely gone on one side. The fire that had taken it had been no recent thing. The burn marks were weathered, the blackened timbers silvered by seasons of exposure. Whatever had happened here, it had happened a long time ago, but there were people inside. Elias moved toward the ruin without making a conscious decision to do so. His boots punched through the crust of old snow as he crossed the ground behind the chapel, his eyes fixed on the gap in the collapsed wall where the voice had come from. He could see the flicker of firelight now, small and struggling, the fire of people who did not have enough wood. He stepped through the gap in the wall and stopped dead. 7 children stared back at him. They were arranged around a fire built inside an old iron cookpot, the kind of improvised hearth that spoke of ingenuity, born from desperation. The oldest was a boy, perhaps 15 or 16, with dark hair and gray eyes that went hard and wary the instant Elias appeared. He was standing, placing himself between the stranger and the younger children, his chin raised in a posture of defiance that was heartbreaking because you could see, underneath it, how frightened he was. The others ranged downward in age. 3 more boys and 3 girls, the youngest no more than 3 years old, a small girl with a red nose and eyes that were swollen from either crying or illness or both. She was wrapped in what appeared to be a piece of burlap sacking around her thin shoulders, as a coat. The oldest boy's jaw tightened. "You can keep moving," he said. His voice was steady. Elias gave him credit for that. "We're not bothering anyone." "You're not bothering me," Elias said. He looked around the ruin. He looked at the fire, pitifully small, already dying. He looked at the children's faces, all of them pale and drawn, several of them flushed with the bright, dangerous color of fever. He looked at the youngest girl's burlap wrap, and something moved in his chest that he had not felt move in a very long time. It felt like the ice cracking over a river in early spring, a terrible, inevitable sound. "How long have you been living here?" he asked. The oldest boy said nothing. "Son," Elias kept his voice quiet, "I'm not from this town. I'm not going to report you to anyone. I just want to know how long." A pause. The boy's gray eyes measured him. 8 months, the boy said finally. "Since last spring, after the fire." Elias looked at the burned walls around them, at the charred timbers, at the ruins of what had been someone's home. "Was this your house?" The boy's jaw worked. "It was our family's house." Was. Past tense. Elias understood past tense. He was made of it. "What's your name?" he asked. Another pause. Then, as if the boy had decided that this particular piece of information cost him nothing. "Gideon Hale. Elias Boone." He did not offer his hand, not yet. He didn't want to spook them. "Who are the others?" Gideon turned slightly and something in his posture shifted. The wariness did not leave, but something protective entered it. He nodded to each of the children in turn. "That's Thomas. He's 12. A serious-faced boy with Gideon's same dark hair, watching Elias with calculating eyes. "Samuel, he's 10. A gap-toothed, freckled boy who looked like he wanted to ask 100 questions but was holding them all in. "Eli, he's 8. A small boy curled near the fire who did not look up. "Anna, she's 7. A girl with braided hair who was coughing softly into her sleeve. "May, she's 5. A wide-eyed girl who had pressed herself against Anna's side. "And that's Clara." His voice changed when he said the last name. Dropped just slightly, went careful and tender. She's 3. Clara, the smallest one, the one in the burlap, looked up at Elias with huge dark eyes and said nothing. Your parents? Elias asked. Gideon's face did something complicated. Father died 2 years ago. Farming accident. A pause. Mother died in the fire. The words were flat. Not because the boy felt nothing. Elias could see exactly the opposite. But because Gideon Hale had said these words enough times to enough people, that he had learned to say them like facts instead of wounds. Elias knew that skill. He had learned it himself. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. People keep saying that, Gideon replied. There was no hostility in it, just exhaustion. It doesn't seem to help much. Elias stood in that ruined cabin for a long moment and did the accounting. 7 children, the oldest barely 16, the youngest 3 years old. One of the middle boys, Eli, the 8-year-old, was clearly sick, not just from cold, but from something deeper, something that had settled into his chest and was making him breathe wrong. The girl Anna was coughing with a ragged persistence that suggested the same thing had gotten into her too. Little Clara's nose was streaming freely, and her eyes had the glassy, overbright look of a child running a fever. Outside, the temperature was dropping toward what the old-timers called killing cold, the kind that could take a healthy adult in a few hours of exposure. These children were not healthy adults. They were burning through whatever reserves they had left, and the fire in that cookpot was going to last another hour, maybe 2. And then there was going to be nothing between them and the cold but each other's body heat and the inadequate shelter of burned walls that blocked wind on only 2 sides. Elias Boone had spent 6 years not getting involved. He had developed that avoidance the way you develop a skill. Consciously, deliberately, one small refusal at a time. He had learned to ride past things that were not his problem. He had learned to see suffering at a distance and keep that distance. He had learned to tell himself that the world was full of suffering and that one man could not fix it, and that the only sensible response was to protect what remained of yourself and keep moving. He looked at Clara's burlap wrap. He looked at Eli breathing wrong. He looked at Gideon's face, that 16-year-old face carrying the weight of a grown man's responsibility, trying to hold together a family that the world had already decided was none of its concern. Something broke loose in him, not gradually, all at once. Can any of them walk? He asked. Gideon blinked. What? The sick ones. Eli and Anna. Can they walk or do they need to be carried? The older boy stared at him with those measuring gray eyes. Why? Because I need to know what I'm working with. Elias was already pulling off his coat, his good wool coat, the best thing he owned, and crossing to where little Clara sat in her burlap. She watched him approach with wary eyes, but did not pull away. He wrapped the coat around her small body, and it swallowed her whole, and she looked down at it with an expression of confused wonder, as if she had forgotten what warmth felt like. Eli can probably walk short distances, Gideon said slowly. Anna too, if you don't push her hard. May and Samuel and Thomas are fine. Clara, I'll carry. Elias straightened up. You said you've been here 8 months. The people in this town, do any of them know you're here? Gideon's expression went very careful. Some of them. That answer told Elias everything he needed to know about Iron Hollow, and none of it was good. All right, he said. There's a grain warehouse on the north end of the main street. It's been empty since summer. I saw it when I rode in. It'll be cold, but it has 4 walls and a roof, and I can get a fire going in there that'll actually heat something. He looked around at the children. I need all of you to put on everything you own. Every piece of cloth in this place goes on a body. We're going to move. Gideon hadn't moved. He was still watching Elias with that wary, calculating look. Why? He said again. Not belligerent, genuine. The question of a boy who had learned that adults who offered help usually wanted something in return. Elias looked at him. He thought about the answer. He could have said something easy, something reassuring and comfortable that would have moved things along. Instead, he said the truth. Because somebody should have done this months ago, he said. And nobody did. And I'm here now, and I can't ride away from this. I've tried to be the kind of man who rides away. I'm not sure I'm able to do it anymore. Gideon looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to the younger children and said, "Put your things on, all of them. We're going with him." Getting 7 children through a blizzard was not a small thing. Elias had been in bad weather before, real weather, the kind that the frontier served up with a casual cruelty that could still shock you even when you knew it was coming. He had crossed flooded rivers and ridden through dust storms, and once, years ago, had been caught in an ice storm in the open with only his horse for warmth. He had survived those things. He knew what survival in bad weather required. It required not stopping, not panicking, and making every decision fast before the cold made decisions impossible. Clara rode on his back, wrapped in his coat, her small arms locked around his neck with a grip that surprised him with its strength. Thomas and Samuel helped Eli between them, each of them taking one of the sick boy's arms over their shoulders and walking him forward. Gideon had May on his back and was leading the way, following Elias's directions through the blinding white of the storm. Anna walked on her own, coughing steadily, May reaching back every few feet to grip the older girl's hand. It was 400 yards from the ruins behind the chapel to the grain warehouse. It felt like 4 miles. The wind hit them as soon as they cleared the shelter of the chapel wall, a wall of frozen air that drove ice crystals into every exposed patch of skin and stole the breath from your lungs. Clara buried her face against Elias's neck. He could feel her shaking. He talked to her as he walked, a continuous low murmur of sound, not words exactly, just noise to let her know he was there and still moving and still warm. He had done this before, not with a child on his back, but he had talked to himself through bad moments, and he had learned that the voice mattered, that as long as you could hear yourself speaking, some part of your brain believed things were going to be all right. Just keep moving, he told himself. 1 step, another step. Don't think about how far, just the next step. Gideon materialized at his shoulder, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with ice. "The warehouse," he said, having to shout over the wind. "You're sure it's unlocked?" "It's not," Elias called back, "but the lock is rust. I'll handle it." The older boy processed this without comment. There was a pragmatism to him that Elias recognized, the pragmatism of someone who had learned that the world rarely made things easy, and that you worked with what you had. The warehouse door had a padlock, and the padlock was rust and age, and Elias broke it with 2 blows from the heel of his boot, while Gideon shielded the smaller children from the wind with his body. The door swung inward on screaming hinges, darkness inside and cold, but still air, and that alone was an enormous relief after the howling chaos outside. "In," Elias said. "Everyone in." He counted them through the door. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And Gideon last, pulling the door shut behind them. 7. All 7. He had not realized he was holding his breath until he let it go. The warehouse was large and empty, smelling of grain dust and old wood, with a plank floor and high rafters lost in shadow. Not warm, the cold had settled into the walls and the floor, but windless, and that mattered enormously. Elias went to work. He had spent 6 years on the frontier, and he knew, practically and specifically, how to make a fire from nothing. He found boards loose enough to pry from a secondary partition wall at the rear of the building. He found iron horseshoe nails scattered across the floor that gave him something to work with. He cleared a space on the dirt floor in the corner where a chimney pipe from some long-gone stove had left a hole in the wall, and he built a fire with the methodical efficiency of a man who has done it thousands of times and understands that speed and care are not opposites. The children watched him. No one spoke. When the fire caught and began to grow, Clara made a sound, a small, wondering sound, like a child seeing something she had stopped believing in. She shuffled forward on her knees toward the warmth, and Elias moved back to give her room, and the other children followed, cautiously at first, then all at once, pressing together around the fire in a knot of small bodies, and the sound of them breathing began to even out. Elias sat back against the wall and watched them. Gideon was the last to come to the fire. He remained standing a few feet back, watching Elias with those gray eyes, as if he still expected something to go wrong, as if the arrival of an unexpected warmth was merely the opening move in a game he did not yet understand. "What happens now?" the boy said. "Now," Elias said, "I go find a doctor for Eli and Anna." He paused. "And I go find food." "The doctor in town is Dr. Marsh," Gideon said. "He knows about us. He hasn't come." The words landed quietly and stayed there. Elias looked at the sick children by the fire. Eli had fallen asleep almost immediately, his breathing still labored but steadier in the warmth. Anna was coughing into her sleeve, trying to do it quietly, as if she didn't want to call attention to herself. "He'll come today," Elias said. Something in his voice must have settled the question, because Gideon didn't argue. "What are you going to tell people?" the boy asked instead. "About us." Elias thought about it. He thought about the town he had ridden into. The particular quality of its silence, the way people moved with their eyes carefully forward, the deliberate incuriosity of people who have decided not to know something because knowing it would require them to act. "The truth," he said. Gideon's expression shifted, not quite hope, not quite fear, somewhere in between. "They already know the truth. They know a version of it," Elias said. "They know the version where you're someone else's problem." He stood up, brushing the dust from his knees. "I'm going to make it harder for them to believe that." He crossed to the door and pulled it open, letting in a slash of freezing air and white light. He looked back at the 7 faces around the fire. At Gideon, standing apart from the others but positioned between them and every possible danger, the way a 16-year-old boy had apparently been standing for 8 months. "I'll be back before dark," Elias said. "Keep the fire going. Don't open this door for anyone you don't know." "How will we know it's you?" Thomas asked, the 12-year-old with the calculating eyes. Elias thought for a moment. "I'll knock 3 times, he said. "Then twice. 5 knocks total." Thomas nodded, apparently satisfied by the operationally specific nature of this answer. Elias stepped out into the storm and pulled the door shut behind him. He stood in the blizzard for a moment with his eyes closed. He was thinking about what it had cost him to come back from grief, what it had cost him to keep going after the worst thing that can happen to a person had happened to him. He was thinking about Catherine and the boys. He still thought about them every day, would always think about them. They were not something you got over. They were something you carried. He was thinking about the particular shape of Clara's arms around his neck, her grip stronger than it should have been for a child her size, the grip of someone who had learned that letting go was dangerous. He was thinking about a 16-year-old boy standing between 7 children and a world that had decided to look away. He opened his eyes. "Move," he told himself. And he moved. Dr. Marsh's office was above the general store, accessible by a narrow staircase on the building's exterior that had been shoveled clear enough to navigate, though barely. Elias climbed it and knocked on the door at the top. A long pause. Then the sound of movement inside. Then the door opened, and a man appeared, mid-50s, heavy through the shoulders, with a physician's hands and a physician's careful, observant eyes. He looked at Elias. He looked at the snow coming down behind him. He looked back at Elias. "Can I help you?" "You can," Elias said. "I need you to come see some sick children. 2 of them are in real trouble. Chest illness. The kind that gets worse in cold weather. They've been living in a burned-out cabin behind the old chapel. They're at the grain warehouse on North Street now." The doctor's expression went through something complicated. Not surprise. That was the telling thing. He was not surprised. He looked like a man who has heard an alarm clock ring and has been hoping he could sleep through it. "I know about those children," Dr. Marsh said carefully. "I assumed you did," Elias said. His voice was flat. Not angry. Not yet. "You're coming anyway. Now look here. 2 of them have chest fever. The younger one's been breathing wrong. The little girl is running a temperature." Elias kept his eyes steady on the doctor's face. "How long have you known about those kids?" A silence. "A while," the doctor said finally. "How long is a while?" Dr. Marsh's jaw tightened. The look of a man who does not like being backed into a corner by a stranger. "Since summer, but you have to understand, the situation in this town, it's complicated. Is a child with chest fever complicated?" Elias said. "Or is that just medicine?" The words hung between them in the cold air. The doctor looked at him for a long moment. Elias did not look away. "Give me a few minutes to get my bag," Dr. Marsh said. He came. That was the first thing. He came, and he examined Eli and Anna with a thoroughness that told Elias the man's conscience had always been functional, whatever his choices had been before today. He gave Elias a list, specific, practical, prioritized, of what the children needed: willow bark for fever, mustard plasters for the chest, warm broth, as much as they could take, rest above everything else. And he left medicine, actual medicine, from his bag, set on the warehouse floor beside Eli's sleeping form. "They're tough kids," he said to Elias quietly as they stood near the door. "Tougher than they should have had to be." "Yes," Elias said. The doctor hesitated, looked at the 7 children around the fire. Something moved through his face, the particular expression of a man taking an accounting of himself and not entirely liking the result. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Keep them warm," Elias said. "Feed them. Get them well." A pause. "Whatever comes after that, we'll figure out." Dr. Marsh nodded slowly. He picked up his bag. At the door, he stopped and looked back. "There are people in this town," he said, "who are going to want to involve themselves in this situation. Not everyone will have good intentions." "I already assumed that," Elias said. The doctor looked at him with something that might have been respect, or might have been the beginning of it. "My name is Charles Marsh," he said. "If you need anything, medical or otherwise, you can find me." "I know where you live," Elias said. The ghost of a grim smile crossed the doctor's face. He went out into the storm. Elias stood in the doorway a moment after he left, looking at the town through the curtain of falling snow. Iron Hollow looked the same as it had when he rode in. Small, weathered, turned inward on itself against the cold. But something had changed, something small and irreversible. He had knocked on a door and a man had answered and done the right thing, and that was a small stone dropped into still water, and the ripples were already moving, and there was no way now to undrop the stone. He went back inside and pulled the door shut and came to the fire where 7 children were gathered in the warmth. Clara was asleep now, curled against Samuel's side, her small face slack and peaceful, the terrible tension gone out of it. Gideon was sitting close to Eli, watching his brother breathe, counting the breaths the way you do when you've been afraid of them stopping. He looked up when Elias came in. "Doctor came," he said. It was not quite a question. "Doctor came," Elias confirmed. Gideon looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back at Eli, at his brother's chest rising and falling in the firelight, steadier now, less labored, the warmth doing what warmth does. "Nobody's ever—" he started. Stopped. Started again. "People kept saying they'd help, and then they—" "I know," Elias said. He sat down on the floor beside the fire, close enough to feel the heat. "I know." They sat in silence for a while. The storm howled outside. The fire burned steady and low. One by one, the younger children drifted toward sleep, leaning against each other with the unconscious trust of the very young. Gideon did not sleep. He sat with his brother and watched the door. Elias sat with him. He had not intended to stay more than one night in Iron Hollow. Outside, the snow was still coming down, deep and silent and impassable, and it occurred to him that perhaps the storm had its own ideas about that. And for the first time in 6 years, since the day that had broken him open and remade him as a hollow thing, Elias Boone did not want to run. He realized, exactly where he was supposed to be. He did not know yet what that meant. He did not know what it was going to cost him. But the hollow place in his chest, the one that had been empty for 6 years, was no longer entirely empty. 7 children were breathing in the firelight. That was enough, for now. That was more than enough. The storm broke on the 4th day. It did not break gently. The frontier never did anything gently. It broke the way a fever breaks. All at once, with a kind of exhausted finality, leaving behind a world so white and still and blindingly bright that looking at it hurt. The drifts along Iron Hollow's main street stood 6 feet high in places. Icicles the length of a man's arm hung from every eave. The sky, finally emptied of snow, was the particular shade of winter blue that looks beautiful and means nothing good about the temperature. Inside the grain warehouse, 7 children had survived. More than survived. In 4 days, Elias had converted the warehouse from an empty shell into something that functioned, however roughly, as a home. He had found an old pot-bellied stove abandoned behind the livery stable. The stable hand, whose name turned out to be Pete, had helped him drag it across the frozen street without asking a single question, which Elias noted and filed away. He had traded 2 days of labor at the general store, splitting wood, moving inventory, for enough food to feed 7 children for a week: dried beans, salt pork, a sack of cornmeal, a jug of molasses. He had negotiated with Mrs. Tilden, who turned out to have a storage room full of old blankets she was renting to no one, and had acquired 6 of them for $1.50, and the promise to repair her back fence when the weather permitted. Eli's breathing had steadied by the second day. Anna's cough had not disappeared, but it had softened, the dangerous rattle going out of it as the warmth and the willow bark and the mustard plasters did their work. Claire's fever broke on the 3rd morning, and when it broke she woke up and looked at Elias across the warehouse and said, in a voice of profound 3-year-old authority, "I'm hungry." It was the best thing anyone had said to him in years. The children were resilient in the way that children who have had to be resilient always are, with a speed that was both admirable and quietly heartbreaking, because no child should have to learn that particular skill so young. By the 3rd day, Samuel had organized a wood stacking system near the stove. Thomas had assumed responsibility for the morning fire with a seriousness that would have been funny if it weren't so clearly important to him. May had appointed herself Clara's guardian and followed the smallest girl everywhere with a watchful maternal intensity that seemed borrowed from someone decades older. Gideon watched all of it. He watched Elias, specifically, with those gray eyes that cataloged everything and gave away nothing. He helped, efficiently, without being asked, anticipating needs before they were voiced, but he maintained a careful distance, as if he had not yet decided what category to put this stranger in. The category of people who stayed. The category of people who left. He was keeping the question open, Elias understood, because the last time he had answered it prematurely, he had been wrong, and being wrong about that particular question had consequences he was not willing to absorb again. Elias did not push. He understood the arithmetic of broken trust. On the morning after the storm broke, he was outside splitting wood behind the warehouse when he heard boots crunching across the packed snow, and turned to find a man he had not seen before standing at the corner of the building, watching him. The man was tall, taller than Elias by 2 or 3 inches, with the broad, settled look of someone who had been the largest and most powerful person in every room he'd entered for so long that he'd stopped noticing it. He wore a heavy buffalo coat and a hat that had probably cost more than Elias's horse. Behind him, at a respectful distance, stood 2 other men, younger, harder-faced, with the particular blank attentiveness of hired muscle. He was smiling. It was the kind of smile that had learned, over many years, to look like warmth. "You'd be the stranger who moved those Hale children," the man said. His voice was deep and smooth, the voice of someone comfortable speaking and accustomed to being listened to. "Word travels fast in a small town." Elias set the axe down. Not away from himself, just down, handle in reach. "Word does?" he agreed. "Victor Blackwell." The man did not offer his hand. He stated his name the way you state a landmark, something that needs no further identification. "I own the Blackwell Ranch, about 12 miles northeast of here. Perhaps you've heard of it." "I haven't been in Iron Hollow long enough to have heard of much," Elias said. Blackwell's smile held. "Well, you will." He looked at the warehouse. "Those children, the Hale orphans. I've been aware of their situation for some time. It's a tragedy, what happened to their family. A real tragedy." He paused, letting the sympathy sit there like a coin laid on a counter. "I've been meaning to formalize some arrangements for their care. There's plenty of room at my ranch. Work for the older ones, shelter for all of them. It's a fair offer." "You've been meaning to formalize it," Elias said. "For how long?" Something moved behind Blackwell's eyes, quick and gone. "These things take time. Paperwork, legal considerations. They've been in a burned-out cabin for 8 months, Elias said. "Paperwork usually moves faster than 8 months." The smile did not leave Blackwell's face, but it changed temperature slightly. "I understand you're new here. You don't know how things work in Iron Hollow. There are relationships, histories, complexities that take time to understand. I understand sick children in the cold," Elias said. "That's not very complex." Blackwell studied him. The study was careful and thorough, the evaluation of a man who had spent a lifetime sizing people up and acting on his assessments with confidence. Whatever he concluded about Elias Boone, he kept it behind the smile. "I'll be pursuing legal custody of those children," he said. His tone did not change. It was still pleasant, still smooth. That was what made it land the way it did. Not as a threat exactly, but as information delivered by someone who considered the outcome already decided. Through proper channels, the territorial court, it's the right thing to do for them, and I have the resources and the standing to make it happen quickly. I'm sure you'll do whatever you've decided to do, Elias said. A pause. Blackwell tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he's recalibrating. You're planning to contest this, he said. Less smooth now, genuinely curious almost. I'm planning to make sure those children have someone in their corner, Elias said, whatever that requires. Blackwell looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the warehouse. Then he looked back at Elias, and for just a second, a fraction of a second, the smile went away entirely, and something else was there in its place, something flat and calculating and entirely devoid of warmth. Then the smile came back. Good morning, Mr. Boone, he said, and turned and walked away across the snow, his two men falling into step behind him. Elias watched him go. He picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood, but his mind was working. He thought about the way Blackwell had said the children's situation was a tragedy, while simultaneously making clear he'd known about it for months. He thought about the two men standing at a careful, practiced distance, close enough to be presence, far enough to be deniable. He thought about the word resources, the way Blackwell had laid it down like a card in a game where he held most of the deck. He thought about a burned-out cabin and 7 children and 8 months of everyone in town knowing and no one doing anything about it, and he thought about why that might be, and the shape of the answer was starting to become clear. He was still thinking about it when Gideon appeared in the warehouse doorway. That was Victor Blackwell, the boy said. It was not a question. Yes. He came to see you. He came to tell me he's going to pursue legal custody of you and your brothers and sisters. Gideon's face did something that was not quite surprise and not quite fear, more like the recognition of something that had been expected for a long time. The particular expression of someone whose worst prediction has finally come true. He's been saying that since last summer, Gideon said. One of his men told Thomas in the street, said Mr. Blackwell was going to take care of us. He said the last 3 words in a flat tone that communicated exactly what he thought of them. 3 boys on his ranch ran away last year. One of them came through town. He said, the boy stopped. His jaw tightened. He said things. What things? Elias asked. Gideon looked at him directly. That Blackwell works them from before dawn to after dark. That the ones who don't work fast enough get the back of a hand. That the word care doesn't mean what he says it means. Elias set the axe against the wall and crossed to the doorway. He stood close enough to the boy that he was speaking at a normal volume, not across a distance. Tell me everything you know about Victor Blackwell, he said. What Gideon knew, and what Elias subsequently learned from Charles Marsh over a cup of coffee in the doctor's office 2 days later, and what Pete at the livery stable added in fragments over several mornings of quiet conversation, added up to a picture of a man who had built his power in Iron Hollow the way certain men always build their power, carefully, over years, through a combination of genuine wealth, strategic generosity, and the very deliberate application of fear. Victor Blackwell had arrived in the territory 15 years ago with cattle money and Eastern connections, and a talent for acquiring land that other people were in the process of losing. He had bought up failing ranches and foreclosed farms at prices that were legal and insulting simultaneously. He had lent money to businesses in Iron Hollow, the general store, the saloon, the sawmill, at terms that seemed reasonable at signing and became instruments of control over time. He contributed to civic causes and showed up at community events and shook every hand available, and he used all of this to construct a version of himself that the town had largely accepted. The successful man who had built something from nothing, who was hard but fair, who could be difficult but ultimately meant well. Beneath that version was the one that the people who worked for him knew. The foreman who had been replaced after raising a concern about conditions on the ranch. The family that had lost their land to a debt Blackwell had quietly purchased from a bank 2 counties away. The boy, Pete's cousin, as it turned out, who had worked on the ranch for 8 months and come back thinner and quieter and with a set to his jaw that had not been there before. Why doesn't anyone say anything? Elias asked the doctor. They were sitting on opposite sides of Marsh's desk, and the older man had a cup of coffee in both hands, as if he needed something to hold on to. Because he owns half the town, Marsh said, or close enough to it, The store owner owes him money. The man who runs the sawmill owes him money. The woman who prints the newspaper—" He stopped, shook his head. "She doesn't owe him money, but her husband does. And Blackwell has made it clear over years that opposition has costs." He looked into his coffee. "That's why nobody helped those children. Not because they didn't know. Because helping them meant standing up to Blackwell's claim. And standing up to Blackwell is something this town has not been able to do." "He hasn't made a formal claim yet," Elias said. "He will now. You've provoked him." Marsh looked up. "You understand that's what this morning was. He came to look at you and decide if you were a problem. And you told him you intended to be one." The doctor paused. "He has lawyers in Cheyenne. He has a judge who owes him a political favor. Not here. He'll try to move the hearing to a more favorable venue. He has money, and he has time, and he has connections that go further than anything you can see from the street." "What do you have?" Elias said. Marsh blinked. "What do I have?" You. Charles Marsh, physician, man who knows what's been happening and hasn't been able to do anything about it yet." Elias looked at him steadily. "What do you have that you could bring to bear on this?" A long silence. The doctor set his coffee down. "I have a medical record," he said slowly, "of every time a worker from Blackwell's ranch came through my door. I kept notes. He stopped, seemed to hear himself from the outside. "I kept notes because I thought someday someone would ask." "Someone's asking," Elias said. The days that followed moved fast and slow simultaneously. Fast in terms of events, slow in terms of the particular waiting tension of a situation that was clearly going to break one way or another and had not broken yet. Elias established a routine with the children because children needed routines the way fires needed oxygen. Breakfast together. Some form of lessons in the morning. He was no school teacher, but he could read and do arithmetic, and so could Gideon, and between them they kept Thomas and Samuel and Anna and May from losing ground on what education they'd had. Afternoons were for practical work, because the warehouse needed constant maintenance and wood needed to be split, and there were always 100 small tasks that kept the cold at bay. Evenings were for stories, because Clara demanded them with an absolute toddler's certainty that this was a reasonable thing to demand. Clara had decided, somewhere in the second week, that Elias was hers. She did not make this declaration in words. She made it in the way she tracked him across the warehouse with her eyes whenever he moved, and in the way she appeared at his elbow at mealtimes with her bowl held up like an offering, and most definitively in the way she had taken to crawling into his bedroll in the middle of the night and installing herself against his side with the implacable confidence of someone who has found the warmest spot in the room and sees no reason to apologize for it. The first time it happened, he had lain awake for an hour afterward, staring at the warehouse ceiling, feeling the small weight of her against him. It was the first time in 6 years he had felt the particular weight of a sleeping child, and it was both unbearable and exactly bearable enough to endure. He did not move her. He did not sleep much either, but he did not move her. The town was watching. He could feel it, the way a room watches when something unusual is happening in the corner. People found reasons to pass the grain warehouse. The general store owner, a quiet man named Harlan Webb, began leaving small additions to Elias's orders, an extra quarter-pound of coffee, a handful of dried apples, without explanation or charge. The woman who ran the dressmaker's shop appeared one afternoon with 3 dresses for the girls, worn but clean and warm, and handed them to Elias at the door with a look that said everything about what she had been carrying and nothing about how long she intended to carry it. Pete, the stable hand, showed up one morning with 2 boys his own age and spent 3 hours helping Elias reinforce the warehouse's south wall against the wind without being asked and without accepting any payment. Small things. Individual decisions made quietly, without coordination, without anyone saying anything out loud about what they were doing or why. But Blackwell was watching too. The formal custody petition arrived at the territorial courthouse in the second week of January. Hand-delivered by a man in a suit who did not look like he belonged in Iron Hollow and who left on the afternoon stage without speaking to anyone. Elias heard about it from Marsh, who heard about it from the courthouse clerk, who was the sister-in-law of the dressmaker who had brought the girls their dresses. That was how information moved in Iron Hollow. Quietly, sideways, through women's networks and backdoor conversations. Through the particular grapevine of people who live in a small place where the official channels are not safe. Elias read the petition that evening, sitting close to the stove while the children slept. It was written in the language of concern, full of words like welfare and stability and appropriate provision. It described Victor Blackwell as a man of standing and resources, a pillar of the frontier community, ideally positioned to provide for 7 orphaned children. It described the current arrangement with a dryness that was its own form of accusation. 7 minor children residing in an abandoned agricultural storage facility under the informal supervision of an itinerant laborer of no fixed address and no established means of support. Itinerant laborer of no fixed address. He set the paper down. He thought about the ways in which that description was accurate. He had no land, no permanent home, no money beyond what he earned day to day, no family connections to call on, no letters of reference from prominent men, nothing that would impress a territorial judge. He had 7 children who had stopped flinching when he came through the door. He was trying to decide how much weight that carried in a courtroom when Gideon spoke from the darkness. "What does it say?" Elias looked up. The boy was awake. Had probably been awake the whole time, lying in his blankets on the far side of the warehouse, listening to the sound of Elias reading in the firelight. "It says Blackwell is making his move," Elias said. There was no point in softening it. Gideon Hale had been dealing with unvarnished reality for 2 years. He did not need it filtered. Gideon sat up. In the low light, he looked very young and very old at the same time. "Are you going to fight it?" he asked. "Yes." "Do you think you can win?" Elias considered the question. He thought about what he had and what Blackwell had and the distance between those 2 inventories. He thought about a doctor's careful medical records and a stable boy who had helped him move a stove without being asked and dresses brought to a door without explanation. "I think more people in this town are on your side than Blackwell wants anyone to believe," he said. "I think the fear he's built here is real, but it's not permanent. Fear never is, once someone proves it can be walked through." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "What if it's not enough?" he said. The question was almost toneless, not desperate, not dramatic, just the honest question of a boy who had learned to think past the comforting version of things. "Then we figure out what's next," Elias said. "But I'll tell you this, Gideon. I have stood in courtrooms before, and I have faced men who thought the size of their wallet settled the question. Sometimes they're right, but not always." He paused. "And I am considerably harder to discourage than I look." A silence. Then, from the darkness, something that might have been the beginning of a sound. Not quite a laugh, but in the neighborhood of one. "You don't look that hard to discourage," Gideon said. "That's the advantage," Elias said. Another silence. Longer this time. "Mr. Boone." The boy's voice had changed, quieter. Younger somehow, in the dark, away from the daylight in which he maintained himself so carefully. "Why are you doing this? You didn't have to stop, you didn't have to stay. You could have ridden on when the storm broke." Elias looked at the fire for a long time before he answered. "I had a family," he said finally. "A long time ago. Wife, 2 sons. They died. Fever took them, the summer of '79. He felt the words leave him, felt the weight of them, the familiar weight he carried everywhere. "After that I rode. For 6 years I rode, and I told myself that was just who I was now. A man who moved. A man who didn't stop long enough to lose anything else." He was quiet for a moment. "And then I found 7 children in a burned cabin, and the oldest one of them was standing between his brothers and sisters, and everything trying to hurt them, and I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought that's what I would have wanted someone to do. If it had been my boys, if I hadn't been there, I would have wanted someone to stop." The warehouse was very quiet. "I'm sorry," Gideon said, "about your family." "Thank you," Elias said. Does it ever stop hurting?" Elias thought about that honestly, the way the boy deserved. "It changes," he said. "It doesn't go away. But it changes. It goes from being the only thing you can feel to being something you carry alongside everything else." A pause. "You know about that. You've been carrying it yourself." "Yeah," Gideon said softly. "Yeah, I have." They sat in the dark, and the fire crackled between them, and outside the prairie winter pressed against the walls of the warehouse that had become, in some strange and provisional way, a home. Somewhere in the middle of the floor, Clara made a small sound in her sleep and curled tighter into her blankets, and May shifted to press against her without waking, and the small constellation of sleeping children breathed in the warmth of the stove. Gideon lay back down in his blankets. After a while, his breathing evened out. Elias sat by the fire a little longer, thinking about what came next. Thinking about lawyers he couldn't afford, and judges he didn't know, and a powerful man who had spent years making sure the town of Iron Hollow understood what opposing him cost. He thought about Charles Marsh's medical records. He thought about Pete and his 2 friends and 3 hours of unpaid labor on the south wall. He thought about the dresses brought to the door in silence. Brick by brick, he thought. That's how you build something that can stand. Not all at once. Brick by brick. And you don't stop laying them. He banked the fire for the night and lay down in his own blankets and stared at the ceiling. He thought about Victor Blackwell's smile. The temperature it had gone when the warmth left it. That fraction of a second glimpse of what lived beneath the charm. He had seen that look before. He knew what that look meant. It meant a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted and had very little experience with the alternative. Elias closed his eyes. He had given that man an alternative. Now they were both going to find out what he was made of. The hearing was set for the 14th of February. Elias learned this from the same sideways network that had delivered every other piece of important information since he'd arrived in Iron Hollow. Through Marsh, through the courthouse clerk, through the invisible architecture of people who talked to each other in back rooms and over fences and in the quiet margins of a town that had learned to keep its real conversations away from the center of things. 2 weeks away. 14 days to build something capable of standing against Victor Blackwell's lawyers and money, and 15 years of accumulated influence in the territorial courts. He started the next morning. The lawyer he found was a woman, which surprised him slightly, and then stopped surprising him the moment she opened her mouth. Her name was Ruth Calloway, and she operated out of a single-room office above the millinery shop, the same closed millinery shop Elias had noted on his first day in town. The shop had been her mother's. She had taken the office upstairs when she passed the territorial bar examination 4 years ago, and she had been practicing law in Iron Hollow ever since, in the particular way that a woman practicing law on the frontier practices it, with twice the preparation of any man in the room and the permanent expectation of being underestimated. She was perhaps 35, with dark eyes that moved quickly, and a stillness about her that suggested she had learned to conserve her energy for things that mattered. Elias laid the custody petition on her desk and watched her read it. She read it twice. She set it down. She looked at him. You have no land, no established income, no permanent address, and no legal relationship to these children, she said. Blackwell has all of those things and a petition already filed. I know what I don't have, Elias said. I need to know if you understand what you're walking into. This isn't a dispute between equals. In a territorial custody proceeding, the judge weighs stability, provision, demonstrated capacity for care. On paper, you don't have any of those things in forms the court recognizes. And on paper, Blackwell does. Yes. So we need to get off paper, Elias said. Ruth Calloway looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression. Not softened exactly, but recalibrated. Tell me about the children, she said. Everything, from the beginning. He told her, all of it, the burned cabin, the burlap wrap, the cookpot fire, Gideon standing between his siblings and the stranger at the gap in the wall. He told her about Eli's breathing and Anna's cough and Clara's fever breaking. He told her about 8 months of a town that had known and chosen not to see. He told her about Dr. Marsh's records, about Pete and the reinforced south wall, about the dresses brought to the door without a word. She listened without interrupting. She took notes in a small, precise hand. When he finished, she set her pen down. Marsh's records, she said. Can he be persuaded to testify? He's already there, Elias said. He's been waiting for someone to ask. There are others who've worked on Blackwell's ranch. Men and women who left under circumstances that might be characterized differently than Blackwell would characterize them. She paused. Finding them and convincing them to come forward is the problem. People in this territory know what it costs to speak against a man like that. Then we find people who are more afraid of what happens if they stay silent, Elias said. Ruth looked at him steadily. That's easier said. Most things worth doing are. A silence. She tapped her pen against the desk once, twice. "I'll take the case," she said. "My fee is whatever you can manage, paid when you can manage it. I am not doing this for the money." She picked up the petition and looked at it again. "I am doing this because I have watched Victor Blackwell operate in this territory for 4 years, and I have been waiting for an opportunity that had a reasonable chance of succeeding." She looked up at him. "You are a thin reed, Mr. Boone, but you're what we have." "I've been called worse," Elias said. The 2 weeks before the hearing were the hardest and strangest of the time Elias had spent in Iron Hollow. Harder in some ways than the first days of the storm, because the storm had been a clear and physical enemy, and this was something else entirely. This was navigating the complicated interior of a town that was in the process of deciding what it was, which is one of the most difficult things a community can do and one of the most important. Ruth Calloway worked with a focused intensity that reminded Elias of a hunting dog following a scent, methodical, tireless, incapable of distraction. She located 3 former Blackwell Ranch hands within the first week, men who had left the ranch under varying degrees of duress and had settled in different parts of the territory. She wrote letters. She sent telegrams. She made the case for each of them that the opportunity they'd been waiting for had arrived and was not likely to come again. 2 of the 3 agreed to come to Iron Hollow. The third wrote back a single sentence: "I have a family now, and I cannot afford to lose them." Ruth set that letter down without comment, and Elias watched her face and said nothing because there was nothing to say. The man had made the only calculation he could make, and condemning him for it required a certainty about other people's courage that Elias did not possess. Marsh prepared his testimony with the thoroughness of a man settling an old debt with himself. He organized 6 years of medical records, every worker from Blackwell's ranch who had come through his door, every injury described as an accident that bore the particular signature of something else, every sick child from the families of men in Blackwell's employ who had arrived without resources because their wages had been docked for reasons that shifted with each telling. He cross-referenced. He annotated. He assembled it into something that was not just a doctor's notes, but a quiet, devastating portrait of a pattern. "I should have done this years ago," he said to Elias one evening, without being prompted. "You're doing it now," Elias said. "That's a generous way of looking at it. It's the only useful way." Meanwhile, the town continued its slow, uncertain movement. Not dramatic. Nothing in Iron Hollow happened dramatically, except the things that happened all at once at the end. But the carpenter named Joel Hess, who had been fixing Elias's warehouse wall in exchange for what he described as a favor yet to be determined, told Elias over their third shared morning coffee that he had grown up on a ranch where the owner had treated his workers the way Blackwell treated his, and that he had some things he might be willing to say in a courthouse if someone gave him a reason to believe it would matter. The school teacher, a thin young man named Arthur Finch, who taught the territory's children in a one-room building adjacent to the main church, and who had apparently been trying for 2 years to establish some official arrangement for the Hale children without getting anywhere, appeared at Elias's door one afternoon with a written statement attesting to his attempts and their obstruction. He handed it to Elias without ceremony, adjusted his glasses, and said, "Whatever I can do," and walked away before Elias could respond. Elias had not expected any of this. He had hoped for some of it. The gap between hoping for something and watching it actually happen had a quality he had forgotten about. A quality he did not have words for, something adjacent to gratitude but larger and less personal, something that had to do with people rather than things. He mentioned this to Gideon one afternoon while they were stacking wood in the pale winter sunlight behind the warehouse. "People are showing up," he said, "more than I expected." Gideon stacked a log carefully. "They were always there," he said. "They just needed to see someone else go first." Elias looked at him. "You sound like you've thought about that," he said. The boy shrugged with the studied casualness of someone expressing something important. "I thought about it a lot. All those months. Why nobody came. I was angry about it for a long time." He stacked another log. "Then I figured they were scared. Not bad, mostly. Just scared. And scared, people wait to see what direction things are going before they move. That's a very generous interpretation. Maybe." A pause. "Or maybe it's just true." The morning of the 14th arrived with a clear sky and a cold so deep it felt personal, Elias dressed in the best clothes he owned, which were not very good. A dark wool coat that was clean but worn at the elbows, trousers that fit, boots he had polished the night before by the light of the stove while the children slept. He stood outside the warehouse in the early morning and looked at the sky for a while, thinking about nothing in particular, which was the thing he always did before something difficult. Inside he could hear the children moving, the specific sounds of the warehouse in the morning, Clara demanding breakfast, Samuel's voice rising in some minor dispute with Eli, the steady efficiency of Gideon organizing the others. The sounds of a family, he thought, and then noticed that he had thought that word and did not flinch away from it. He went back inside. Gideon was waiting for him near the door, dressed in his own best clothes, a clean shirt that was slightly too small across the shoulders now, testament to the fact that he had grown since someone had last bought him one. His gray eyes were steady. "Ready?" Elias asked. "Are you?" Gideon said. It was the kind of question that deflects the real answer by asking another question, and they both knew it. Elias put his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. "Stay with your brothers and sisters this morning," he said. "Mrs. Tilden has agreed to watch them. You'll be brought in when Ruth says it's time." Gideon nodded. His jaw was set. "When?" he said. "Working on it," Elias said. The territorial courthouse in Iron Hollow was, architecturally, a modest building that seemed to understand it was being asked to carry a weight above its station. It had been built with civic aspirations that the territory's budget had not quite fulfilled. Solid timber construction, an elevated bench for the judge, benches for spectators along both walls, and an air of attempting dignity that was undercut slightly by the stovepipe running crookedly through the ceiling and the wanted poster that someone had forgotten to take down from the wall behind the defendant's table. Blackwell arrived first. He came with 3 men in suits, which was 2 more lawyers than the proceeding technically required. He came with 6 character witnesses, prominent men of the territory, ranchers and merchants, and 1 representative from the county land office, all of them sitting in a prepared row with the composed look of people who have been briefed and know their lines. He came with documents, financial statements, property assessments, letters of endorsement from men whose names Elias did not know, but whose names clearly meant something to the judge, because he saw the judge glance at them and nod slightly before the proceeding began. He came, in short, prepared for a proceeding he expected to control. Elias arrived with Ruth Calloway and Charles Marsh and 2 former ranch hands named Cole Decker and Will Pryor, both of whom had the particular expression of men doing something that frightened them and doing it anyway. He arrived with Joel Hess and Arthur Finch, who had come without being asked twice. He arrived with a handful of written statements from people who could not be present but had set their names to paper, which was its own form of courage. He sat down at the plaintiff's table and looked across the room at Victor Blackwell. Blackwell was already looking back at him. The smile was in place. Composed, confident, the smile of a man watching an outcome unfold the way he had arranged for it to unfold. Elias held his gaze and did not look away. The judge, a man named Herbert Crane, transported from the district court 2 towns over, called the room to order with a single sharp rap of his gavel. He was a compact, gray-haired man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the expression of someone who had presided over enough frontier proceedings to have lost most of his patience with drama. "This is a custody hearing, not a theatrical production," he said, surveying the packed room. "We are here to determine the appropriate placement of 7 minor children, the Hale children, currently residing in Iron Hollow. I will hear arguments and testimony in an orderly fashion. I will not hear speeches. I will not hear character assassination unsupported by evidence. I will not hear anything that wastes my time." He looked at both tables equally. "Do we understand each other?" Both sides indicated that they understood each other. Blackwell's lead lawyer, a large man named Prescott, with an expensive suit and the confidence of someone who bills by the hour and has never lost, went first. He was good. Elias gave him that. He was organized and persuasive and knew exactly how to use language to make the facts of the situation read the way his client needed them to read. He talked about stability and provision and the clear capacity of a man of Victor Blackwell's standing to provide for 7 children. He talked about the inadequacy of a grain warehouse as a residential environment. He talked about Elias Boone, the itinerant laborer, he said, and made it sound like an epitaph, with a particular combination of dismissiveness and faux concern that was designed to make Elias seem not malicious but simply irrelevant. Not the kind of man you would trust with 7 children's futures. Not through any fault of his own, of course. Just the simple arithmetic of a man without resources. He called his character witnesses. They testified with the polished brevity of men who had been instructed to say specific things and had said them before. Victor Blackwell was generous. Victor Blackwell was a community pillar. Victor Blackwell had the room and the resources and the standing. The judge listened. He wrote notes in a small, tight hand. Then it was Ruth Calloway's turn. She stood up and looked at the room for a moment, just a moment. And in that moment, something happened to the quality of the air, the way the air changes when a storm that has been building finally commits to arriving. Your Honor, she said, the petitioner has described a very clear picture of what Victor Blackwell has to offer these children. I intend to describe an equally clear picture of what Victor Blackwell has already done to other children, not unlike them, in his employ, on his property, over the past several years. Prescott was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. The character of my client is not at issue. The character of the man seeking custody of 7 children, Ruth said, without raising her voice, is precisely at issue, unless the court is prepared to argue that the disposition of 7 orphaned minors is unrelated to the history of the man who seeks legal authority over them. Judge Crane looked at her over his glasses. I'll hear it, he said. Briefly, Counselor, and supported. Yes, Your Honor. She called Charles Marsh first. The doctor took the stand with the bearing of a man who had made his decision and was no longer uncertain about it. He testified quietly and precisely, in the language of medicine and documentation, and what he described was not dramatic but was, in its accumulation, extraordinary. 7 years of records, 17 workers from Blackwell's ranch who had come through his door with injuries, 8 with descriptions that did not match the stated causes, 4 children of Blackwell employees treated for malnutrition, 2 women, wives of ranch hands, who had come to him in private with bruises they had explained away and whom he had believed and who had, over the years, stopped coming, which could mean they had gotten better or could mean something else. He described each case without embellishment. He produced his records, organized and annotated, and submitted them as evidence. Prescott cross-examined with controlled aggression, suggesting the injuries were consistent with ranch work, suggesting the documentation was incomplete, suggesting that Dr. Marsh's interpretation was a matter of opinion rather than fact. Marsh answered each challenge with the same quiet precision he had brought to the testimony. He did not become flustered. He did not become defensive. He had spent 6 years keeping these notes, and he knew what they said. Then Ruth called Cole Decker. Decker was 30 years old and had the look of someone who had been physically strong once and was not anymore in quite the same way. Not from aging, but from something that had gone wrong in him and hadn't entirely healed. He sat in the witness chair and looked at the room and specifically did not look at Victor Blackwell, in the particular way of someone who has decided that looking at a thing is unnecessary because they carry it with them everywhere anyway. He testified for 40 minutes. He described working conditions on the Blackwell Ranch over 3 years of employment. He described the wages, what was promised versus what was paid, the system of deductions and fines that ensured most workers received substantially less than their contract specified. He described the discipline applied to workers who did not meet the targets Blackwell set, which moved along a spectrum from financial penalty to something less easily categorized. He described the boy, 14 years old, the son of a hand who had left owing Blackwell money, who had worked 18-hour days through a summer harvest and been told at the end of it that his father's debt meant his wages did not exist. 14 years old, Judge Crane said, not quite to anyone. His pen had stopped moving. Yes, sir, Decker said. Continue. Will Pryor corroborated independently. He had worked the ranch 2 years after Decker, and what he described was the same architecture, the same system, the same methods, the same outcomes. He was a smaller man than Decker and visibly more frightened on the stand, and the fact that he was there anyway said something that his testimony did not need to say explicitly. Blackwell's table had gone quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of confidence. Prescott was writing notes rapidly. One of the other lawyers had leaned close to Blackwell and was speaking in a low voice, and Blackwell was listening with a stillness that was a different kind of stillness than the composed confidence he had brought into the room. Then Ruth called the children. Prescott objected immediately, and at length. The children were minors. The children were potentially coached. The emotional impact of child testimony was prejudicial. The judge listened to all of it with visible patience and then overruled it with 3 words. They'll testify. Gideon came in first. He walked through this courtroom door and looked at the room, at the spectators, at the lawyers, at the judge, at Blackwell, with those gray eyes that gave away nothing. He sat in the witness chair and squared his shoulders and looked like exactly what he was, a 16-year-old boy who had been carrying a man's weight for 2 years and had gotten very good at it. Ruth walked him through the history quietly, carefully. The fire, the 8 months in the ruin, the cold, the hunger, the sickness, the names of the townspeople he had asked for help and what they had said. The name of the man, one of Blackwell's, who had come to Thomas in the street and described what awaited them on the ranch. And in your understanding, Ruth said, what did Victor Blackwell intend to do with you and your siblings if he were awarded custody? Gideon looked at Blackwell for the first time since he'd entered the room, directly, without flinching. Work us, he said, same as the others. We would have been labor, not family. The word care was a word he used. It didn't mean what it says. Then Gideon said something that Ruth had not prepared him to say, something that arrived of its own accord in the silence of the courtroom. Mr. Boone never once asked us to earn our place, he said. He never once made us feel like a burden he was calculating the cost of. He stayed, and he kept staying, and when my sister Clara was sick, he gave her his coat. He paused. Not his spare coat, his only coat, in a blizzard. His voice was steady, but something in it had changed. That's what a father does. The courtroom was very quiet. Anna testified next, and May after her, and Samuel, and Thomas. Each of them said different things in different ways with different degrees of composure. Thomas was almost clinical. Samuel stumbled twice and regathered himself. May answered every question looking at a point somewhere above the judge's head, as if she had decided to direct her testimony to the ceiling, which was where she looked when she was thinking hard. Anna testified with a soft directness that was somehow more affecting than drama, describing the morning the fever broke and Elias had made her broth from the last of the salt pork and sat with her while she drank it and told her she was brave and did not leave until she was asleep. And then, because Ruth Calloway understood what she was doing and why, she called Elias Boone to the stand himself. Prescott's cross-examination was methodical and not without skill. He established the absence of land, money, permanent residence, formal education, legal relationship. He established the improvisational nature of the living arrangements. He suggested carefully that good intentions were not the same as adequate provision, and that the emotional bond the children had clearly formed with this man, regrettable as it might be, given the circumstances, did not constitute a stable foundation for 7 children's futures. Mr. Boone, Prescott said, in the tone of a man closing an argument he considers already closed, you have no home, no land, no savings, no legal claim to these children. By every objective measure available to this court, you are not in a position to provide for 7 children's long-term welfare. Isn't that correct? Elias looked at him. By the measures you're listing, he said, yes. Thank you. I wasn't finished. He looked at the judge. I have no land yet. I have no savings yet. I have been in this town for 6 weeks, and in that time, I have kept 7 children warm and fed and safe, and for the first time in 8 months, not afraid when they go to sleep at night. He paused. What I have that the other party doesn't have is this. Those children trust me. They trust me because I showed up every single day, and I didn't leave, and I didn't ask anything from them, and I didn't look at them and see labor or liability or opportunity. He kept his voice steady. I looked at them and I saw children who needed a father, and I knew what that looked like, because I was one. The room was silent. Everything else, he said, I will build. Judge Crane had stopped writing. He looked at Elias over his glasses for a long moment. Then he looked at the room, at the testimony he'd heard, at the records on his desk, at the 2 former ranch hands still sitting in the gallery, at the collection of Iron Hollow citizens who had packed the benches on the left side of the courtroom and were sitting with the particular posture of people who have chosen a side. He looked at Victor Blackwell. Blackwell was looking at the table in front of him. The smile was gone. What had replaced it was not quite anger and not quite fear, but something between them. The expression of a man watching a structure he has built over 15 years develop cracks in places he did not anticipate. The judge rapped his gavel once. "I'm going to recess until tomorrow morning," he said. "Both counsels will have any remaining documents on my desk by 8 o'clock. He looked at the room. "This court is adjourned." The gavel came down. People began to move and speak all at once, the pressure of held silence releasing into noise. Elias sat still for a moment at the plaintiff's table, his hands flat on the wood in front of him, looking at nothing in particular. Ruth Calloway sat down beside him. "You went off script," she said. "I know." It was the right call. She gathered her papers without looking at him. "I've been in a lot of courtrooms, Mr. Boone. I have never heard a judge stop writing his notes to listen to a witness." She paused. He stopped writing. Elias looked toward the door where Joel Hess was waiting with his hat in his hands, and Arthur Finch beside him, and Pete from the livery stable who had apparently come without telling anyone, and behind them the teacher and the doctor and the carpenter and the woman from the dressmaker's shop, and a dozen other people from a town that had spent 15 years afraid, and had, today, done something about it. He looked at all of them. He thought about a grain warehouse in a blizzard, and a boy standing between his siblings and everything trying to hurt them. He thought, brick by brick. He stood up from the table. The recess lasted through the night and into the next morning, and Elias did not sleep much of it. He lay in the warehouse in the dark and listened to the children breathe, and turned the day over in his mind the way you turn a stone over looking for what lives underneath it. The testimony, the records, the way Judge Crane had set his pen down, the way Blackwell had looked at the table in front of him when the smile finally went away. These were good things, and Elias knew they were good things. And he also knew that good things on the frontier had a way of lasting exactly until something else happened. Ruth had been cautiously optimistic when they parted outside the courthouse. Cautiously was the word she had emphasized, and he had heard the emphasis and respected it, because she was a careful woman, and careful women on the frontier did not become cautious without learning why. The testimony was strong, she had said, pulling her coat tighter against the evening cold. The medical records are strong. The character witnesses Blackwell brought were established men, but established men can be answered by documented facts, and we have documented facts. She had paused. But Crane is not from here. He doesn't know Iron Hollow. He doesn't feel what this town has been living under. He sees paper and testimony, and on paper, Blackwell still has resources you don't have. What does he need to see? Elias had asked. Tomorrow, she had said, I'm going to ask for one more witness. Someone who hasn't testified yet. She had looked at him. Someone the judge might not expect. He had asked who, and she had told him, and he had thought about it for a long time after she walked away. Now, in the dark of the warehouse, he was still thinking about it when the sound reached him. It was subtle at first. A change in the quality of the wind outside. A low pressure settling over the building like a hand pressing down. Elias had spent enough years on the open frontier to recognize that sound in his sleep. He sat up. He looked at the stovepipe, where the draft had changed direction. He looked at the gap under the warehouse door, where the thin line of cold air that always crept through had gone from moving left to moving not at all. The stillness before a storm. He was on his feet before he was fully awake. He crossed to the door and opened it, and the cold hit him like a wall. Not the ordinary frontier cold he had grown accustomed to over the past weeks, but something deeper and more serious. The kind of cold that falls out of the northern sky when the temperature drops fast and a weather system the size of a territory is coming down behind it. The sky to the northwest was the specific shade of yellow-gray that old-timers called wolf sky, and the clouds massing on the horizon were moving fast and dark and low. He shut the door. He turned back to the warehouse and found Gideon sitting up in his blankets, watching him with the immediate alertness of someone who has learned to read the quality of another person's movement. How bad? The boy said. Bad enough, Elias said. We need to make sure we have enough wood inside and the stove is banked right. Go back to sleep. We'll deal with it in the morning. But Gideon did not go back to sleep, and Elias did not either. And by the time the gray light of early morning filtered through the warehouse's small, high windows, the storm had arrived. Snow coming sideways. Wind that made the warehouse walls flex and groan. The temperature outside, by Elias's reckoning, had dropped to something that could kill a man in 30 minutes if he was unprepared, and in less if he was unlucky. He got the children up and fed them and stoked the stove until the warehouse was as warm as it could be made, which was warm enough. Clara clung to his leg while he worked, May and Anna staying close to the stove with the instinctive common sense of children who have spent enough time in real cold to know what it means. Samuel and Eli engaged in their usual low-grade morning argument about something that did not matter. Thomas sat near the door and read, by what light came through, the book he'd borrowed from Arthur Finch held close to his face. Normal. Ordinary. A morning like other mornings. Elias counted them. Clara, May, Anna, Samuel, Eli, Thomas. He counted again. He walked the length of the warehouse. He checked the rear corner where Gideon kept his blankets and the small wooden box he used for his few belongings. The box was there. The blankets were folded. Folded, not abandoned. The specific neatness of someone who had left intentionally rather than in distress. But Gideon was not there. The particular cold that came up Elias's spine then had nothing to do with the temperature. "Thomas," he said, his voice was level, "when did you last see Gideon?" Thomas looked up from his book. He processed the question and something changed in his face. "He was here when I woke up. That was—" He glanced at the windows. "An hour ago, maybe." An hour. In this storm. In this temperature. Elias was already pulling on his coat. "Nobody opens this door," he said. "Nobody goes outside for any reason. Thomas, you're in charge until I'm back. Keep the fire going." "Mr. Boone." It was Clara's voice, small and absolute from somewhere behind him. He turned. She was standing in the middle of the warehouse floor in her oversized dress, looking at him with those dark eyes. "You come back," she said. It was not a question. It was an instruction delivered with the full authority of a 3-year-old who had decided how this was going to go. He crossed to her and crouched down to her level. "I come back," he said. "I promise." She studied him for a moment, weighing the promise the way she weighed everything. Seriously, without sentimentality. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied. He went out into the storm. The cold took him in the face like a fist the moment he cleared the door, and the wind was worse than it had sounded from inside. A sustained, driving force that pushed against him with something close to intention. He pulled his hat down and his collar up and oriented himself by the bulk of the warehouse wall at his back, because you could not navigate by sight in this. You navigated by what you knew, by the mental map of the town you had built over weeks of walking it in all weather, by counting steps and maintaining direction against the push of the wind. He thought about where Gideon would have gone. He thought about the boy in the courtroom the day before, the steadiness of him, the way he had looked at Blackwell directly when he testified, the particular things he had said about Elias without having been coached to say them. He thought about what came after that. The walk back from the courthouse, the evening around the stove, the way Gideon had been quiet in a manner that was different from his usual watchful quiet, turned inward, processing something. He thought about the conversation they'd had weeks earlier in the dark, about what it meant to carry grief, about the way fear of losing more kept a person from feeling the things that were already there. He thought about a 16-year-old boy who had been holding everything together for 2 years and who had, in that courtroom, in front of everyone, said out loud the thing he had been carrying the whole time. He thought about what it sometimes does to a person to finally say the truest thing out loud, how it can unsteady you, how the weight you've been carrying can shift when you set part of it down, and the shifting can throw you off balance in ways you didn't anticipate. He turned north. The burned cabin behind the old chapel was a 1/4 mile from the warehouse, and in good weather it was a short walk. In this storm it was something else entirely. Elias moved through it with his head down and his arms slightly out for balance against the wind, counting his steps, keeping the general shape of the town at his left shoulder as a guide. He passed the chapel by its bulk more than its visibility. The building was barely an outline in the white, and pushed around to the back. The ruins were almost buried. The snow had drifted against the charred walls until the whole structure was half submerged, a black and white ruin that looked less like a home and more like an open wound in the ground. Elias worked his way through the snow to the gap in the wall where he had first stepped through, weeks ago, in another storm, with no idea what he was about to find. He found Gideon the same way he had found him the first time, by the voice. Not loud, not calling for help, just a sound underneath the wind, a sound that Elias's ears had learned to search for without being told to. The boy was sitting in the corner of the ruin where the walls were highest, and the snow had drifted to create something close to a windbreak. He was sitting with his knees drawn up and his arms around them, and he was not moving, and his face, when Elias got close enough to see it, was the specific pale gray of someone who has been in serious cold for too long. Elias crossed to him in 3 long strides and grabbed his arm. "Up," he said. "Right now. On your feet." Gideon looked up at him. His eyes were present but slow. The cold, slowed look of someone whose body had started making hard decisions about where to direct its remaining warmth. I was just going to... His voice was thick. "I needed to think. I just needed to..." "I know what you needed," Elias said. He had his hands on the boy's arms now, pulling him to his feet. "You can tell me all of it when you're not turning blue. Stand up. Come on." Gideon stood unsteadily. His legs had stiffened in the cold, and he stumbled when he tried to take a step, and Elias caught him and did not let go. He got his arm around the boy's shoulders and held him against his side. And then, because the math of heat and distance was clear and unambiguous, he shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around Gideon's shoulders over the boy's own inadequate jacket. Gideon tried to push it back. "You need that. You need it more," Elias said. "Move." They moved. It was harder going back than coming out, because Gideon's legs were not fully under him, and the wind had shifted, and the snow was deeper now in places it had not been deep before. Elias kept his arm around the boy and kept them both moving, counting steps again, feeling the cold work through his shirt and into his shoulders, and understanding at a practical level that he had maybe 20 minutes before this became a different kind of problem. He did not think about 20 minutes. He thought about the next step, the one after that. "I heard what you said," Gideon said. His voice was steadier now that he was moving. "In the courtroom. About your family." "This is not the time. I've been thinking about it all night." The boy's breath came in white clouds that the wind tore away immediately. "You said you had been trying to be a man who rides away. You said you weren't able to do it anymore." A pause. "I keep thinking, what if you had? What if you'd just ridden on?" "I didn't." "But what if..." "Gideon," Elias kept walking, "I need you to save this conversation for somewhere warm." A silence, marked by the howl of the wind and the crunch of their boots through the snow. Then, quietly, "I thought I ruined it." Elias stopped walking. He turned to look at the boy, and Gideon was looking back at him with an expression that had nothing in it of the careful composure he maintained so consistently. What was there instead was raw and young and frightened, the face underneath the face, the one that only came out when the defenses were down. "What did you think you ruined?" Elias said. "The case? The hearing?" The boy's voice was rough. "I said things up there that Ruth didn't tell me to say. About you. About calling you..." He stopped, swallowed. "Prescott was looking at me like I was playing on the judge's emotions, like it was a trick, and Blackwell's lawyer was whispering something, and the other men were writing things down, and I thought I made it worse. I thought I gave them something to use." His jaw worked. "I thought I cost us everything because I couldn't keep my mouth shut." Elias looked at him for a long moment. The wind drove snow between them. The cold was working through Elias's shirt now with serious intent, but he stood still because some things required stillness. "What you said up there," he said, "was the most important testimony anyone gave. Not because it was emotional, because it was true. And the truth in that courtroom was worth more than anything Blackwell's lawyers could build out of paperwork and influence." He held the boy's gaze. "You didn't cost us anything. You gave the judge the one thing nobody else could give him, the answer to the only question that actually matters in a custody hearing." Gideon's expression was uncertain. "What question?" "Whether the children are loved," Elias said simply. The boy looked at him. The wind howled. Something moved through Gideon's face, a slow shift, like ice moving at the beginning of a thaw. Not dramatic, not sudden, just the beginning of something that had been frozen for a long time starting, cautiously, to come loose. "We need to keep moving," Elias said, "right now." They kept moving. When the warehouse door opened and Elias came through it with Gideon, the children reacted with a simultaneity that he did not expect, and that did something complicated to his chest. Thomas was on his feet instantly. Samuel made a sound that was not quite a word. May grabbed Clara's hand. Anna pressed forward and then stopped herself. as if she'd remembered something about not showing too much. Clara did not stop herself. She crossed the warehouse floor at a dead run and flung herself at Gideon's knees with her full 30-some pounds of determined 3-year-old, and Gideon caught her and held her, and something in the way he held her, the way his eyes closed and his arms went around her, spoke to exactly what had happened to him in that ruin, what he had gone back there to feel, and what he was now, in this moment, choosing instead. Elias got the coat off Gideon and got the boy in front of the stove and got warm broth going while Thomas worked on the fire, and Samuel, without being asked, disappeared into the blankets and came back with every spare one they had and deposited them around Gideon's shoulders. May pressed in on one side and Anna on the other, and Eli, who almost never showed physical affection to anyone, leaned his head briefly against Gideon's arm and then moved away as if he'd never done it. They were, Elias thought, watching them. They were a family doing what families do, not performing it, just doing it, the way breathing is done, without deciding to. Gideon looked up from the middle of his siblings and found Elias across the room. Elias looked back at him. No words. No words were needed. The storm had eased enough by mid-morning for travel, and Elias and Ruth made it to the courthouse ahead of Judge Crane's 8 o'clock deadline by 10 minutes. Elias's fingers were still stiff from the cold, but his mind was clear in the particular way that comes after a physical ordeal. Stripped down, direct, unbothered by the peripheral. Ruth met him in the courthouse entry with the expression of someone who has been up most of the night and has made good use of it. "I have one more witness," she said. "You mentioned that last night. Her name is Margaret Alcott. She is 61 years old and she owns 2,000 acres northeast of here, and her late husband did business with Victor Blackwell for 11 years. She paused, until her husband came to understand the precise nature of that business. She wrote a letter to the Territorial Land Office 4 years ago, outlining specific fraudulent practices in Blackwell's land acquisition history. The letter was filed and not acted upon." Another pause. "She has been waiting for an opportunity to say what she knows in a setting where it cannot be buried. Does Blackwell know about the letter?" "He does. He has spent 4 years making sure no one with authority has taken it seriously." Ruth straightened her papers. "He did not anticipate it appearing in a custody hearing." Elias considered this. "Neither did I." "That's rather the point." Judge Crane resumed the session with his usual economy of expression and called for any remaining testimony. Prescott made a brief and polished closing summary that emphasized stability and resources, and the court's obligation to consider the children's long-term welfare with clear eyes rather than sentiment. He said the word sentiment the way you say the word stain. Then Ruth stood up. She called Margaret Alcott. The woman who walked through the courtroom door was not what the room expected. She was silver-haired and small-framed, dressed with the plain elegance of someone who has money and does not need to display it. And she moved with the specific, unhurried confidence of a person who has not been intimidated in a very long time. She took the stand and looked at the room, and then deliberately looked at Victor Blackwell. He looked back at her, and for the first time since the proceedings began, something flickered in his eyes that was not controlled. She testified for 30 minutes. She described 11 years of her husband's business dealings with Blackwell, the initial partnership, the gradual realization of how that partnership actually functioned, the pattern of land acquisition that involved manufactured debt, strategic foreclosure, and the particular use of legal instruments to accomplish what more direct methods could not. She described 3 families she knew by name who had lost their land to Blackwell's methods. She described a specific instance involving a widow and her son, a ranch not 20 miles from Iron Hollow, that had been taken through a process she characterized, in the careful language of a woman who had spent 4 years preparing these words, as deliberate and systematic fraud. Prescott cross-examined her with everything he had, and what he had was not enough, because Margaret Alcott had been ready for this cross-examination for 4 years, and she answered every challenge with the precision of someone who has memorized the facts because they had personally cost her something, and she had decided those facts were not going to be wasted. Blackwell's table, by the time she stepped down, had the atmosphere of a room from which the air has been quietly evacuated. Ruth made her closing argument standing very still, speaking in a voice that did not need to be loud because the room was already leaning toward it. She said that this hearing had begun as a custody dispute and had become something larger. Not because anyone had intended it, but because the truth had a way of taking up more room than the question that let it in. She said that what the court had heard was not a collection of individual grievances, but a pattern, and that the judge was being asked to place 7 children into the care of the man at the center of that pattern. She said, Victor Blackwell has resources. He has land and money and connections, and the considerable advantage of having operated in this territory long enough to build the appearance of respectability. What he does not have, what this hearing has demonstrated he has never had, is the capacity to see a child as anything other than an asset to be managed. Elias Boone has nothing that appears on a financial statement. What he has is a grain warehouse full of children who sleep without fear for the first time in 2 years because someone decided they mattered. The court must decide which of these things has more weight. She sat down. The room was quiet. Judge Crane looked at his notes for a long time. He looked at the evidence on his desk. He looked at the gallery, the packed benches on the left side of the room, the citizens of Iron Hollow who had come back for the second day, more of them now than yesterday. The room fuller than it had been, because word had moved through the town the way word moves when something important is happening, and people have decided they want to be part of it. He looked at Blackwell. Blackwell was looking straight ahead. The composure was still there, technically. His posture was correct, his expression controlled. But the smile was gone and had not come back. And the absence of it changed his face entirely, revealed the structure underneath the performance. And what was underneath was not a man of warmth and community standing. It was a man calculating damage and finding the numbers difficult. The judge took off his glasses and set them on the desk. "I'm going to render my decision now," he said, "rather than take it under advisement, because I think this community has waited long enough for clarity on this matter." The room held its breath. The petition of Victor Blackwell for legal custody of the 7 Hale minor children is denied. A sound moved through the gallery. Not quite a cheer, not quite an exhale. Something between them. Crane raised his gavel slightly, and the room went quiet again. The court finds that the evidence presented raises serious questions regarding the petitioner's fitness as a guardian, and I am referring the testimony and supporting documentation in this case to the Territorial Attorney General's office for further review. He looked at Blackwell as he said this, and there was nothing in the look that was personal, but there was nothing in it that was unclear. Temporary legal guardianship of the 7 Hale children is hereby awarded to Elias Boone, pending a formal review of a permanent arrangement to be completed within 90 days. He looked at Elias directly. "Mr. Boone, I suggest you use those 90 days to put yourself in a position that removes the word temporary from this arrangement." "Yes, Your Honor," Elias said. The gavel came down. The sound in the gallery this time was not restrained at all. Elias sat at the plaintiff's table for a moment after the room began moving around him. He sat with his hands flat on the surface of the table and looked at the middle distance and breathed. Ruth was already on her feet gathering papers. People were moving toward him. Joel Hess with his broad carpenter's grin, Arthur Finch pushing through the crowd with his hand out, Pete from the livery stable somewhere at the back of the room making a sound that was not designed to be dignified. He heard all of it at a slight remove, the way you hear things when something inside you is very still. He thought about Catherine. He thought about his boys, their faces, specific and beloved and gone. He thought about the 6 years between that loss and this room, the long, empty road of it. He thought about a burned cabin and a cookpot fire and a 16-year-old boy standing up in the gap in the wall. He thought about Claire's instruction this morning, delivered with 3-year-old certainty. "You come back." He thought, "I came back." Ruth's hand landed briefly on his shoulder as she moved past him, and he came back to the room and the noise and the people moving toward him. He stood up. He shook Joel's hand, he shook Arthur's hand. He looked at Charles Marsh across the room, and Marsh nodded once, the nod of a man who has paid a debt he owed himself. He looked for Blackwell. Blackwell was already leaving, moving toward the door with his lawyers close around him. The posture of the group closed and defensive, the body language of a retreat executed with as much dignity as a retreat allows. At the door he stopped for a moment, and he turned, and for just a second his eyes found Elias across the thinning crowd. There was nothing in them now that resembled a smile. What was there instead was the look of a man confronting the specific knowledge that something is over, something he had built carefully over many years, and that the confronting of it is only beginning. Then he went through the door, and it swung shut behind him, and the moment was over. Elias turned and walked out of the courthouse into the cold, clear air. The storm from the night before had blown itself out, and the sky was the deep, sharp blue of a winter day gone suddenly clean, the kind of blue that hurts your eyes and makes the world look like it has been recently rinsed and set out to dry. The snow on the ground reflected the sunlight in long white sheets, blinding and beautiful. He stood on the courthouse steps and looked at Iron Hollow, at the main street, at the buildings he had come to know by name and occupation, at the people coming out of the courthouse behind him, talking to each other with the animated energy of a town that has done something together and knows it. He thought about what the judge had said. Use those 90 days. He pulled his coat tighter against the cold. He had work to do. The 90 days the judge had given them were not quiet days. Elias had known they wouldn't be. A man like Victor Blackwell did not absorb a public defeat and recalibrate quietly into a better version of himself. That was not how men like Blackwell were built. They were built for forward motion, for the accumulation of advantage, for the persistent application of pressure until things bent the way they wanted them to bend. When that motion was arrested, when the pressure failed and the thing refused to bend, they did not stop. They redirected. The first indication came 3 weeks after the hearing, when Ruth Calloway received a legal notice informing her that Blackwell intended to appeal the custody ruling on procedural grounds. Specifically, that the introduction of Margaret Alcott's testimony had exceeded the scope of a custody proceeding and constituted improper character evidence. The notice was written in the dense, airless language of men who charge by the hour and have access to more hours than the other side, and what it communicated beneath the language was simple. This is not finished. Ruth read it at her desk and set it down and looked at Elias across the surface of the cluttered wood with an expression he had come to recognize. The expression she wore when she was thinking fast and did not want anyone to see how fast. "He's not appealing because he thinks he'll win," she said. "He's appealing because the process costs money and time, and he has more of both than you do. He wants to exhaust us." "Can he win on the procedural argument?" Elias asked. "It's thin." Alcott's testimony was relevant to the question of Blackwell's fitness as a guardian, which is directly at issue in a custody hearing. Any appellate judge worth the title will see that. She paused. But thin arguments in the hands of expensive lawyers in front of judges who have their own relationships with powerful men are not the same as no argument at all. Elias looked at the notice on her desk. He thought about the 90 days and what they required. He thought about the judge's specific instruction: put yourself in a position that removes the word temporary from this arrangement, and the practical arithmetic of what that meant. Land. Income. Something that looked, to a territorial court, like permanence. He thought about Margaret Alcott. "I need to go see someone," he said. The Alcott property sat 12 miles east of Iron Hollow, on a rise of land that caught the winter light and held it in a way that made the whole spread look deliberate. Not just built, but considered, each structure placed with an understanding of the relationship between shelter and landscape that came from either long experience or good instinct or both. The main house was substantial without being ostentatious, the barns weathered to a silver gray that matched the winter sky, the fences running straight and well-maintained across land that had been worked seriously for a long time. Margaret Alcott met him at the door before he knocked, which suggested she had seen him coming from a distance and had been expecting something like this visit, if not this specific man. "Mr. Boone," she said, "come in before you freeze." The interior of the house was warm and ordered and smelled of coffee and pine wood, and she poured him a cup without asking and sat him down at a kitchen table that had clearly seen a great deal of use over a great many years. She sat across from him with her own cup and looked at him with the direct evaluating gaze of a woman who had spent 61 years deciding quickly which people were worth her time and had gotten very good at the assessment. "You're here about the appeal," she said. "Partly," Elias said, "and partly about the 90 days. She listened while he explained. The judge's requirement, the practical gap between where he was and where the court needed him to be. The timeline pressing down on both problems simultaneously. He did not soften it or frame it strategically. He had found, since Iron Hollow, that the plainest version of the truth was usually the most efficient, and Margaret Alcott struck him as a woman who would find anything other than plain truth mildly insulting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee. "My husband and I never had children," she said. It was not a non sequitur. He waited. Not for lack of wanting them. It was simply not something that happened for us. And after a certain point, you make your peace with it and build your life around what you have instead of what you don't. She looked up at him. I have 2,000 acres and a house that has more rooms than I use and work that requires more hands than I currently employ. A pause. I have been looking for a manager for this property for 2 years. Someone with integrity and practical ability and the kind of judgment that can't be hired by the hour. Elias looked at her. I watched you in that courtroom, she said. I have watched you in this town for the past 6 weeks, from a distance, the way you watch something to understand what it actually is, rather than what it presents itself as. She set her cup down. I'm going to make you an offer, Mr. Boone, and I want you to hear it entirely before you respond. All right, he said. I'm offering you the position of property manager for the Alcott Ranch, at a salary sufficient to support a family of 8, with a house on the northeast corner of the property. 4 bedrooms, sound roof, working stove, that is currently empty and has been empty for 3 years. The position is permanent, not conditional, not a favor. It is a job I need done by someone I trust, and you are the first person in 2 years who has given me a reason to use that word. She looked at him steadily. In exchange, I ask only for the work itself, done honestly, and perhaps, occasionally, the company of 7 children at a dinner table that has been too quiet for too long. Elias sat with that for a moment. He thought about what Ruth had said. Thin arguments in the hands of expensive lawyers. He thought about a territorial court weighing permanence and provision and the particular weight of a fixed address and a demonstrated income and a house with 4 bedrooms on 2,000 acres of working land. He thought about Clara demanding stories by the stove and Gideon watching the door and Anna's cough that had finally, completely, gone quiet 3 weeks into the warmth. Mrs. Alcott, he said, I would like to accept your offer. She nodded once, with the satisfied precision of a woman who has made a good decision and knows it. Then we'll draw up the terms this week. I'll have my solicitor contact Ruth Calloway. She stood and refilled his coffee without asking. Now, tell me about the children. All of them, specifically. I find I've been thinking about them considerably. He told her, and he noticed, as he talked, that she listened with the particular quality of attention that comes from genuine interest rather than courtesy, leaning slightly forward, asking specific questions, laughing at the right moments with a laugh that suggested she had not laughed enough recently and found it welcome. When he described Clara's instruction on the morning of the blizzard, "You come back," something moved across Margaret Alcott's face that she did not try to hide. She sounds formidable, she said. She is, Elias agreed, unreasonably so for 30 pounds. The news of the appeal had reached Iron Hollow by the time Elias returned, and the town's reaction to it had a quality different from the fearful silence that had characterized the town's relationship with Blackwell's power before the hearing. It was not silence this time. It was something closer to anger, the specific anger of people who have done a difficult thing and been told it was insufficient, who have stood up at personal cost and watched the man they stood against refuse to acknowledge that standing. The meeting happened in the schoolhouse on a Thursday evening, organized by no one in particular and attended by what seemed like half the town. Elias sat in the back and listened while people spoke. The general store owner, Harlan Webb, who talked about the debts Blackwell held over businesses in Iron Hollow and what it had cost people to remain silent about things they knew. Joel Hess, who described a neighbor's land lost to Blackwell's methods 3 years ago in terms that were specific enough to constitute a legal account. 2 women Elias did not know who had worked as housekeepers on the ranch and described conditions in language that was quiet and precise and devastating in its quietness. And then Pete, the stable hand, who was 17 and had no official standing in the room and apparently did not care, stood up from the back bench where he'd been sitting and said, in his direct, unornamented way, "We need to send everything we know to the Territorial Attorney General. Not just what came out in the hearing, everything, all of it, from everyone who has something to say. Because Blackwell isn't going to stop unless someone makes him stop, and the only thing big enough to make him stop is all of us at once." The room looked at this 17-year-old boy. Then Harlan Webb said, "He's right." And Arthur Finch said, "I'll help organize the statements." And Charles Marsh said, "I have 6 years of records that are already documented." And the meeting, which had not been called by anyone in particular, became something particular anyway. Became the moment a town that had been living under one man's fear for 15 years decided, collectively and out loud, that it was done living that way. Elias drove back to the warehouse through the cold night air and sat with the sleeping children for a while before he lay down himself, thinking about what he had witnessed. He had not organized that meeting. He had not suggested it, had not anticipated it, had not seen it coming. It had grown from the ground up, the way things grow when the conditions are finally right. Not because any single person made it happen, but because enough individual decisions had accumulated into a direction. He had dropped a stone in still water 7 weeks ago. He had not known then how wide the ripples would go. Blackwell's appeal was filed in the second week of March, and Ruth answered it with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for it since the day the original ruling came down. She filed a comprehensive response that addressed each procedural argument point by point, supported by case precedents from 3 other territorial courts, and a brief from Margaret Alcott's solicitor that addressed the relevance of character evidence in custody proceedings with a legal specificity that made Prescott's original argument look improvised by comparison. But the most significant document that arrived at the Territorial Appellate Court that month was not from Ruth Calloway's office. It was from the Territorial Attorney General. The investigation, triggered by Judge Crane's referral and expanded by the weight of statements from Iron Hollow's citizens, had moved faster than anyone had expected. Faster, in particular, than Blackwell had expected. It had found the letter Margaret Alcott had submitted 4 years earlier and had found, attached to it in the files, a notation from a deputy attorney who had recommended action at the time and been overruled by a superior who was, the investigation found, in a financial relationship with Victor Blackwell that he had not disclosed. The Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation into Blackwell's land acquisition practices across the territory. They subpoenaed his financial records. They interviewed the families named in Margaret Alcott's original letter. They found 3 additional cases that Alcott had not known about, in counties further east, following the same pattern, with the same methods and the same outcomes. The appeal, when the Territorial Appellate Court received both Ruth's response and the news of the Attorney General's investigation, was denied within a week. Denied with a terseness that suggested the appellate judge had other concerns about Victor Blackwell's affairs more pressing than his custody petition. Ruth sent a messenger to the warehouse with a single handwritten line. Appeal denied. Final hearing next Friday for permanent custody. Come ready. Elias read the note at the breakfast table with 7 children eating around him and said nothing for a moment. And then Clara, who was sitting in his lap because she had decided some weeks ago that this was where she sat at meals, looked up at his face and said, "Good?" "Good," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her porridge. The final hearing was nothing like the first one. Not in its drama. There was none. Not in its conflict. There was none of that either, because Blackwell did not appear, and Prescott did not appear, and the row of character witnesses was empty. What sat in its place was the Attorney General's letter and Margaret Alcott's signed employment agreement and the deed to the 4-bedroom house on the northeast corner of her property and Ruth Calloway's careful, comprehensive brief for permanent guardianship. And 7 children, sitting in the gallery in their best clothes. Clara had insisted on wearing a ribbon in her hair, which May had tied with great ceremony that morning. Thomas sat with his back perfectly straight, as if posture could communicate seriousness of intent. Samuel was holding Eli's hand, which he would have denied if anyone had mentioned it. Anna had her arm around May's shoulders. Gideon sat at the end of the row and looked at the judge with those gray eyes that had stopped being wary somewhere along the way and had become something else, watchful still, but no longer braced for the worst. Judge Crane had come back from the district court for this. Elias had not expected that. He had expected a different judge, a procedural replacement for a proceeding considered routine. But Crane was there, in his same seat, with his same glasses pushed up on his forehead, and when Elias came in and saw him, something in the judge's expression suggested that he had made a deliberate choice about this and did not require it remarked upon. The proceeding took 35 minutes. Ruth presented the employment agreement and the house deed and the financial documentation and the character attestations from Marsh, from Alcott, from Hess and Finch and Webb, and a dozen others, a stack of paper that represented the collective decision of a town to say clearly what it thought. She presented the children's statements, written this time at their own request, each of them in their own hand, that she had gathered over the previous week without telling Elias, a fact he discovered when she submitted them and glanced at him with an expression that was as close to mischief as Ruth Calloway ever came. Crane read everything with the thoroughness he brought to everything. He asked 2 questions, one about the employment arrangement's permanence, which Ruth answered, one directed at Elias directly, about his intentions regarding the children's education, which Elias answered in terms specific enough to satisfy, and then he took off his glasses and set them on the desk. In the matter of permanent guardianship of the 7 Hale minor children, he said, the court finds that Elias Boone has demonstrated, over the course of these proceedings and the period preceding them, a consistent and genuine commitment to the welfare of these children that goes beyond the formal requirements of guardianship and speaks to something the court is not always positioned to evaluate but recognizes when it is present. He looked up. Permanent guardianship is hereby awarded to Elias Boone, with all rights and responsibilities thereunder. The temporary designation is removed. He looked at the children in the gallery, at Clara with her ribbon, at Gideon at the end of the row. I hope, he said, in a tone slightly different from his official voice, that these children understand what they have. He brought the gavel down. And that was the end of it, and also the beginning of everything else. They moved to the Alcott property in April, when the worst of the winter had released its grip and the land had begun its slow, muddy return to life. The house on the northeast corner was exactly what Margaret had described. 4 bedrooms, sound roof, working stove, and it was more than that too, because a house is always more than its physical description once people begin to live in it and leave the marks of their living everywhere. Gideon claimed the small room at the top of the stairs without discussion, which was right because it had a window that looked east across the open land, and he had the habit, Elias had noticed, of watching the horizon in the mornings as if checking that it was still there. Thomas and Samuel and Eli took the large back room and established within it a territorial arrangement of considerable complexity that Elias declined to adjudicate. Anna and May settled the front room with the efficiency of young women who know how they want things and have the social infrastructure to make it happen. And Clara's crib, the actual crib that Margaret Alcott had found in her own storage, wooden and solid and smelling of cedar, went in the corner of the room next to Elias's, because Clara had assessed the sleeping arrangements with her characteristic 3-year-old authority and made her determination accordingly. There was a dinner table, a real one, long enough for 8, oak-topped, with mismatched chairs that Margaret had contributed from her own house with the cheerful pragmatism of a woman who has more chairs than she uses. The first meal they ate at it together was a Tuesday in late April, the windows showing the last of the evening light across land that was now, in some provisional and accumulating way, theirs. Elias had cooked, not well, which was something he and the children had a running and affectionate disagreement about, Gideon having become, over the warehouse months, a considerably better cook than Elias and being unable to keep from demonstrating this, but there was food on the table and warmth from the stove, and the particular sound of 7 children in a room that was big enough to contain them. Margaret came for that first dinner, and she brought a pie, and she sat at the end of the table and watched the children with an expression Elias caught once and did not comment on, the expression of a woman receiving something she had stopped expecting and was not entirely sure how to hold. Clara climbed into her lap between the main course and the pie, without invitation or preamble, with the absolute social confidence of a child who has decided that laps are a public resource. Margaret looked down at her. Something moved across her face. She put her arm around the small girl and did not say anything, and Clara leaned back against her with the boneless trust of the very young. And that was that. After dinner, when the younger children had been settled and the dishes done, a process supervised with military efficiency by Thomas and complicated at every stage by Samuel, Elias sat on the porch steps in the cool spring night and listened to the land. The prairie at night had a specific sound, or rather a specific quality of quiet. Not silence exactly, but the absence of human noise, the vast, indifferent breathing of open country that had been here before people and would be here after, and did not particularly require anyone's acknowledgement. He had sat on a lot of porches in 6 years of riding. He had never sat on one that felt like this. The door behind him opened, and Gideon came out and sat on the step beside him without asking. He had gotten taller in the months since January. A fraction of an inch, maybe more. The imperceptible increment of a boy becoming something else. He sat with his forearms on his knees and looked out at the dark land, and for a while neither of them said anything, which was something they had gotten comfortable with. "Thomas cried tonight," Gideon said, "when we moved the last of our things in. He went in the back room and he thought no one could hear him." Elias said nothing. "He'd been holding that for a long time, I think," Gideon said. "He's got a lot of our father in him. Keeps things tight." A pause. "I used to think that was strength." "It is sometimes," Elias said. "The trick is knowing when it stops being strength and starts being a wall." Gideon considered that. "Is that what you did after your family?" "For 6 years," Elias said. "Yes." The prairie breathed around them. "I'm glad the storm came," Gideon said. He said it simply, without performance, the way you say a thing you've thought about long enough that it has become plain. "I know that sounds strange, but if the storm hadn't trapped you here, if the roads had been open, you would have ridden on." "Probably," Elias admitted. "So the storm was good." "The storm was very bad," Elias said. "It was just useful too. Those aren't the same thing." Gideon smiled. A real one, not the controlled, measuring expression he'd worn for most of the months Elias had known him. The smile changed his face considerably, made him look like what he was. A boy at the beginning of things, rather than a boy braced for the end of them. "Are you going to be all right?" Elias asked. Not in a broad sense, the broad sense he could see clearly enough. In the specific sense of tonight, of the moved-in boxes and Thomas crying in the back room, and the weight of a door closing on one chapter and another one open ahead. "Yeah," Gideon said. He said it slowly, testing the word, finding it accurate. "Yeah, I think so." A pause. "Are you?" Elias thought about it honestly. He thought about Catherine and the boys, the grief that did not go away but had changed shape, become something he carried alongside everything else rather than in place of it. He thought about 6 years of empty road and the particular quality of the loneliness of a man who has had something real and lost it and does not know how to want something real again. He thought about a cookpot fire in a ruined cabin and a 3-year-old in a burlap coat and a 16-year-old boy standing up in a gap in a wall. "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." Victor Blackwell's empire did not collapse overnight, but it collapsed thoroughly. The Territorial Attorney General's investigation, fully opened by April, found what investigations find when they look seriously at men who have operated without oversight for a long time. More than anyone expected, in forms more specific than rumor had described. The land fraud cases numbered 7 in total across 4 counties. The financial irregularities in his lending practices were extensive enough to interest federal examiners as well as territorial ones. The employment practices at his ranch were documented by former workers, who came forward once it became clear that coming forward had a result, that the machinery of accountability was actually running and not just warming up. Blackwell fought it. Of course he did. He hired more lawyers and generated more paper and called in every favor he had accumulated over 15 years. And some of those favors held for a while and some didn't, and the ones that held were eventually released under the pressure of the investigation. Finding that the men who owed those favors had sometimes accumulated debts of their own to the same investigation. The ranch was sold in the summer to satisfy creditors. The land holdings across 4 counties were clawed back through the courts, a process that took longer than anyone wanted, but moved consistently in one direction. 2 families got their land back. A 3rd received a settlement. The man from the Attorney General's office who had buried Margaret Alcott's original letter resigned his position in the spring and was facing his own inquiry by fall. Iron Hollow, without the weight of Blackwell's influence on the scales, began to breathe differently. Not dramatically. Towns don't transform overnight. And the habits of 15 years of wariness do not dissolve in a season. But Harlan Webb renegotiated 3 business debts that had been structured to be permanent and found, in their absence, that his margins looked considerably different. The families who had stayed silent for years found that the silence had a door in it that could be opened. Small things, aggregating, the way small things always aggregate into the shape of something large over time. Ruth Calloway took 2 new clients in the spring, both of them cases that had been sitting in the back of people's minds for years, cases against Blackwell's practices that they had not thought they could bring before now. She won both of them. Charles Marsh, who had been keeping notes for 6 years against the possibility that someone would ask, donated his records to the Attorney General's investigation and then donated his time to 2 weeks of testimony that he described to Elias afterward as the most useful thing he had done in his professional life. He stopped looking like a man carrying something he hadn't put down yet. On a warm evening in late June, when the prairie had gone green and the sky was the enormous open blue of a summer that had earned itself after a long winter, the children ate dinner at the oak table and Margaret sat at the end of it, and Pete came by after his shift at the livery stable to return a book he'd borrowed from Thomas, and stayed for pie, which Clara had made with considerable supervision and some autonomous decisions about the amount of molasses that everyone present had agreed not to comment on. After dinner, while the older children argued cheerfully about something that had the recursive escalating structure of a dispute that would probably still be running at breakfast, and Margaret helped May with the braiding she had requested, and Pete and Thomas had their heads together over the book in question, as if the earlier argument about it had simply evolved into a different format, Clara appeared at Elias's elbow in the way she always appeared, suddenly, completely, as if she had materialized rather than walked. She held up her arms. He picked her up. She settled against his shoulder with the ease of long familiarity and looked out at the room with those serious dark eyes, taking inventory of all the people in it with the systematic thoroughness she applied to everything. "Pa," she said. She had not said it before. She said it now the way she said most things, without announcement, without preamble, as if it were simply the accurate word for a thing that had already been true for some time, and she had merely been deciding when to make it official. The room did not stop. The argument between Samuel and Eli continued. Margaret kept braiding. Pete turned a page. The evening moved on the way evenings move when there are enough people in a house to make it feel like something alive. But Gideon, across the table, heard it. He looked up and found Elias's eyes, and something passed between them. Not a word, not even exactly an expression, just a recognition. The acknowledgement of a thing arriving that had been on its way for a long time. Elias looked down at the small girl on his shoulder. He felt the particular weight of her, 30-some pounds of absolute certainty, ribbon in her hair, molasses on her sleeve, completely at home in his arms in a way that suggested she had never seriously considered any alternative. He thought about what he had believed 6 years ago, when grief had remade him into a hollow thing, and he had started riding and kept riding and told himself that the road was who he was now. He thought about all the towns he had passed through without stopping. He thought about the storm that had stopped him, and the ruined cabin, and the cookpot fire, and the gap in the wall where everything had changed. He thought about Catherine, and he thought, "I know you would have loved them." And the thought did not hurt the way it once had. It was still tender, the way healed things are sometimes tender when you touch them. But it was not the open wound it had been. It was part of the full thing, the whole thing, grief and love and loss and continuation all occupying the same space without canceling each other out. He pressed his cheek briefly against Clara's hair. "Yeah," he said quietly, to her and to the room and to no one in particular. "That's right." The table was full. The house was warm. The land outside the windows lay open and green in the last of the evening light, and somewhere out there the prairie was doing what it had always done, enduring, persisting, indifferent to the small human stories played out on its surface. But the stories were not small, Elias thought. They only looked small from far enough away. Up close, in the middle of them, they were everything. They were all there was. He had spent 6 years running from that truth. 7 children had run him to ground. And the family that nobody had wanted, that the town had decided not to see, that the law had tried to hand to the wrong man, that had survived in a burned ruin on a cookpot fire and each other's warmth, had become the thing that changed an entire town's understanding of what it owed itself, had become, in the most ordinary and extraordinary way, home. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Clara had fallen asleep on his shoulder with the swift, total confidence of a child who has no doubt about where she is or whether she is safe. The voices around the table rose and fell and wove together into the particular music of people who belong to each other, messy and warm and alive. Elias Boone sat in the middle of all of it and did not want to be anywhere else. He had thought, in the beginning, that he was rescuing them. He understood now, with the full clarity of a man who has stopped running and turned to look at where he has been, that it had never been that simple, that they had found each other in a storm, all of them lost in their own ways, all of them carrying grief in shapes that could not be named until someone else named theirs first. That the rescue, if that was even the right word, had always gone both directions. That a family was not something you built alone. It was something you became together, one cold morning at a time, one decision to stay at a time, until staying was no longer a decision, but simply the truth of who you were. He looked at the table one more time, at all of them. Then he looked out at the open land and the rising stars, and he breathed, and for the first time in 6 years, the breath went all the way in and all the way out without catching on anything. He was home. The end.